From a very hot end of summer day here in Israel, I would like to say shalom and thank you for joining us for another one of Yad Vashem's online lectures. To those who I have not had the pleasure to meet, my name is Jeremy Weiss and I am a director at Yad Vashem International Relations Division. As we approach the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, I would like to share with you a look behind the scenes of Yad Vashem's artifacts collection and several items related to keeping track of Jewish times during the Holocaust. Despite the harsh living conditions during the Holocaust, many Jews struggled to continue the practice of Jewish tradition and marked the Jewish holidays. They attempted to observe the holidays. They wrote their own prayer books and then created hard, hand-drawn Jewish calendars while in camps or in the ghettos. These items are symbolic of the quest by many for Jewish continuity. I would like to introduce to you my colleague, Sara Shor, who will give you this presentation. Sara is a manager at the Artifact Collection at Yad Vashem Museum and has been working in Yad Vashem since 2000. She's researched and computerized the collection. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all a very good Shana Tova, Happy New Year. Lots of hope. We will get over these challenging periods, and we look forward to seeing you in Israel, in Jerusalem, at Yad Vashem. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to welcome you today to the collection room of the Artifacts Collection in Yad Vashem. My name is Sara Shor. I'm the manager of the Artifacts Collection, and I think we'll begin. So we're coming up to the New Year. New Year, Rosh Hashanah, is a time when we all take stock. We look backwards, we look forwards, and that brings me to the subject of time, of calendars, which usually are sort of items of routine, very, very predictable, nothing special. They kind of sit in the house. And I want to highlight Jewish calendars in particular. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were traditional communities, and life went by for them very much guided by Jewish dates. The flow of Jewish life depended on marking Shabbat, on marking the different festivals, and nothing really happened without the life being framed by these dates. First, I'd like to show you a few printed calendars. And the stories behind them, which I apologize, I'm only going to touch on, are as varied as the geography which is behind them. This, for instance, is a calendar that was printed in the Lodz ghetto, which was one of the largest ghettos. Of course, it opens with a picture of Rumkowski, who was a controversial figure as the head of the Judenrat of the Lodz ghetto. What's interesting is that this calendar, though it's a Jewish calendar that starts from right to left, it begins in January. That's Poland. And then we have these calendars. We have a few of these from Ferramonti in Italy. These were printed as memorial calendar or mementos that were produced when they were liberated, which was actually in 1943 when the British liberated them. The Italians went over to the Allies. And just to take us on a geography tour, this one was printed in Shanghai for the Jewish community in Shanghai in a Jewish bookstore, and it also tells us something about the Jewish community in Shanghai during the war. But the ones that are really interesting are actually the handwritten ones. They, of course, we can wonder how did people manage to write these? So we have actually a number of calendars that we received from menachm rifkind, who was in hiding for a number of years He was saved by righteous Gentiles. And so he was able, each year, he did another calendar, and they were all preserved because he was liberated while in hiding. Then there's some which are very, very rough. This is by Usher. We really don't know much about him. We're still learning. But he did a simple calendar for 1943. It was obviously important to him. Then we have a calendar which someone carefully, well, we actually know it was Shlomo Glick, who carefully had a cover made for this. This is a calendar he gave to his friend, Hellman. The two of them were together in Siberia. They ended up in a Soviet POW camp where they were sent after being in the Hungarian labor battalions. So they were Jews that ended up in an odd place, but they also kept busy making a calendar. And there's even one very small calendar, very tiny. Perhaps we'll be able to focus in on it later. This was actually made in Auschwitz. Two women from Berlin who were together, both as members of a Zionist movement, made this little calendar, and they wrote different things in it. The front page shows they're Zionist. It says L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And they both managed to actually come to Israel after the war. They did survive. The calendar that I would like to show you in detail, though, is a calendar that was made in Terezenstadt. Terezenstadt was considered a model ghetto. And when it suited Nazi propaganda, it was a model ghetto. But really, like all the other ghettos and camps, it was a way station on the way to extermination. This one was actually created, it was originally hand done, but it was created in a kind of blueprint technique that enabled copies to be made. And indeed, in Yad Vashem, we have a number of copies of this calendar. And if we look, it's written, well, first on the cover. I'll deal with the covers. As you can see, it's decorated with the 12 signs of the zodiac and with a title. And on the back, there is a view of a synagogue. There's a Torah scroll there. We can see the stars up in the sky. To find out who actually made this calendar, we have to open it up. And this gives us the clue. Here we see again the interior of a synagogue. The stars, it's probably the same place. There are candles up the side. And we see a chazan standing at the lectern. And most importantly, there's his signature. His signature is A. Burlinger. And we know about Usher Berlinger because he's from other paintings that he did in Terezenstadt. He was a cantor from Schweinfurt in Germany. And he was also an artist and a teacher. After successfully managing to get his two daughters out of Germany on the Kindertransport to England, he and his wife in 1942 were deported to Terezenstadt. There, he continued to be busy in communal work, and I would like to show you a number of images of a synagogue in Terezenstadt that was discovered a number of years ago. And if you look at the photographs, you'll see that it's definitely the synagogue that appears in the calendar. You can see the spans of the arches with the candles and the stars painted on the ceiling. And it's obviously the synagogue that served a Burlinger to paint this calendar. It's interesting that the passages in this synagogue, they tell us something of the pervading mood of the worshippers. And it's not unreasonable to think that Burlinger himself was the one who actually painted these walls. In addition to passages that are common to put in synagogues, we find in the hidden synagogue a quote from the Tachanun, which is an ancient part of the liturgy, and it's chillingly appropriate to the circumstances. Look from heaven and perceive that we have become an object of scorn and derision among the nations. We are regarded as sheep to slaughter, to be killed, destroyed, beaten, and humiliated. Despite all this, we have not forgotten your name. We beg you not to forget us. So, this synagogue and the calendar are obviously connected. Now, if we look at the back of the calendar, there's actually another image of a synagogue painted in color, and it says at the bottom, Bet Knesset Sudeten Kaserna. Now, all the barracks in the Terezenstadt ghetto, as it had originally been a sort of garrison town, all had names of German places. So Sudeten Kaserna gives us a clue as to where this synagogue was. Now, Usher Berlinger was deported from Terezenstadt to Auschwitz on the 28th of September 1944. And if we check the date with the Hebrew calendar, we'll see it was the day after Yom Kippur. Berta was deported a week later. Neither of them survived. One more thing I want to show you, because this calendar has a wealth of information. At the top here, in addition to what's written here in Hebrew, it says Avram Hellman, Terezenstadt. So, who was Avram Hellman? That I'll tell you shortly in the next stage of our talk today. The blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is seen as an act of spiritual awakening. And I want to tell you a story about one shofar in our collection that has a very unusual story. The rabbi of Radoshitz, the Hasidic rabbi, Yitzchak Finkler, found himself, like others from his community in Piotrków, in the Skarżysko Kamienne work camp in Poland. And while they were there, the rabbi very, very much wanted, Rosh Hashanah was coming up, he wanted there to be a shofar to blow in honor of the festivals, of the high holidays. So he came up with an idea that they would bribe one of the guards who would bring him a ram's horn. At first he bribed him, but he brought a horn which turned out to be the horn of an ox. So he bribed him again, and he finally brought a ram's horn. And the rabbi turned to a man he knew from Piotrków, Moshe Winterter, who he knew as a skilled man. He was working Moshe was working in an armaments factory for the Nazis. So he asked Moshe, he pleaded with Moshe to please help him use the machines that they had in the factory to make a shofar. So this shofar is on display in the museum, but here I'll show it to you. Moshe went ahead in spite of the danger. Of course, it was a great danger to actually undertake a private undertaking in a Nazi factory. Even taking things out of the factory was considered something that you could lose your life for. But he actually did as the rabbi requested, and towards Rosh Hashanah of 1943, he made this shofar, and word got round, and everybody in the camp gathered together to have prayers for Rosh Hashanah. And the rabbi, the Hasidic rabbi, actually blew the shofar. And everybody was very, very moved, and the story has been told by many of the survivors. Now, Moshe Winterthur kept the shofar with him afterwards, and all of the prisoners in the camp were actually transferred from that camp to another camp in Częstochowa, which is also in Poland. And there Moshe managed to leave the shofar with someone else when he, and actually the Radishitzer Rebbe, was also transferred out. They were transferred to Buchenwald, where they couldn't possibly keep it with them. So they left it in Częstochowa. And after the war, it was taken by survivors who had remained in Częstochowa until liberation. They took it to the States. And in the 1970s, Moshe Winterthur, who came to Israel, actually managed to get it back and bring it to Yad Vashem. Tragically, the Rebbe himself, Yitzchak Finkler, did not survive the war. He died in Buchenwald. So that's the story of this very, very special shofar. Okay, now I'm going to tell you the story of Abraham Hellman, who I mentioned before, because he was the owner of the copy of the calendar that Usher Burlinger drew in Terezenstadt. He signed his name, as you saw before, inside. So who was Avram Hellman? Well, the Hellman family, Avram and his wife Charlotte, and their three children, where was Max, was Lily, and Edith. They lived in Nikolsburg, which was in Czechoslovakia. The Nazis, of course, came into Czechoslovakia in 1938, before war actually broke out. And the Hellman family were given 24 hours, along with all the other Jews in the community, to leave their homes. So they moved to Brno, which is nearby. That's where Max was actually studying. At that point, they already read the writing on the wall, and Edith, they managed to get onto a youth aliyah group that came to Eretz Yisrael, and Max himself was already older. He was with a group, a Zionist group, who also made their way to Eretz Yisrael. But at the end of 1941, Avram, his wife Charlotte, and Lily, who was still at home, were deported to Terezenstadt. Now, Avram had been a cantor, and he was also, he started a Jewish museum of artifacts from the Jewish communities of Bohemia and Moravia. So he too, like Usher Berlinger, was a cantor, but he also had an involvement in art. The Nazis actually made him pack up the whole collection and transfer it to Prague, which is where pieces from it are actually kept in the Prague Jewish Museum collection today. But the Hellmans themselves came to Terezenstadt. Charlotte was employed in one of the factories, and Avram himself actually continued what he had been involved in beforehand, which was community work. He became a member of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, and he had brought with him a shofar and other artifacts that he had from home. He brought a shofar, he brought a Purim Megillah, and he would serve as a cantor at prayers, just like Burlinger, and he would blow the shofar at Rosh Hashanah, and at Purim he read from the Megillah. We don't know if he had any contact with Usher Burlinger, if they knew each other, but it seems likely they were both involved in community affairs. But it makes us think of all the important people who were making an effort to keep Jewish life alive for the Jews in Terezenstadt. And they were, in this way, sanctifying life, where the Nazis were doing the opposite and basically degrading life for all of the people, made them lose their humanity. So on the 28th of September, like Usher Berlinger, which we remind you, we said was the day after Yom Kippur, Avram Hellman was sent to Auschwitz from Terezenstadt. A few days later, his daughter Lily was sent. Charlotte was lucky enough to be working in a factory that was necessary for the Nazi war effort, so she remained behind, and that's why we've been left with these artifacts that her husband brought to the camp. She also left us with a very, very moving testimony, and I'd like to just finish with that. She tells us of the Kol Nidre, that the Kol Nidre prayers that Avram Hellman led on the eve of Yom Kippur 1944, as he was waiting with 2,000 other men for the transport to leave to Auschwitz. So these are her words. It was Kol Nidre Eve. My husband said, "It's time to pray." He placed two suitcases, one on top of the other, and covered them with a talit. He stood with Levin and his son from Komatau in Bohemia, and the three put their prayer shawls over their heads. When my husband began to pray out loud, a bitter cry rose from the throats of all the men and women. There was not one there who didn't. You cannot even imagine it. It's necessary to understand that most of the Czech Jews were not religious. But things continued like this until the next day, Yom Kippur, for 2 days with no sleep. People sat on their cases. During Yom Kippur, whoever wanted to join the prayers could join. My husband chanted the Unetane Tokef, and an old man, apparently a rabbi from Slovakia, removed his shoes and recited in a fearful cry the vidui, the confession said before death. The women returned to their rooms, but we couldn't sleep. We waited for the sound of the train's departure. At 6 a.m., we heard the train's whistle.